Imagine, you're a parent, and your teenage daughter hasn't come home after a night out.
Oh, God.
And then you get the news she's a victim in a brutal double homicide.
Just awful.
That's what happened to the families of Christine Eady and Helen Scott back in 1977 in Edinburgh.
Yeah, that case, the World's End Murders, it really gripped Scotland for decades.
We're going to examine everything.
Everything.
Well, the events of that night, the investigation, the cold case years, and how DNA technology finally brought the killer to justice.
It's fascinating how forensic science, the fight for justice, and a legal technicality all came together, you know? It almost let a monster get away.
We've got police reports, articles, even courtroom transcripts for this deep dive.
You've really gone all out.
Well, we try to be thorough.
I appreciate that.
So let's set the scene. Edinburgh, 1977. Helen and Christine, both 17, out celebrating new jobs.
That's pretty normal, a typical Saturday night.
Right, they ended up at the World's End pub, a dimly lit, historic pub in Edinburgh's Old Town.
I've heard of it. Is that the one with the...
The stone facade?
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah, so from what we can tell, both Helen and Christine were responsible young women, well-liked, loving families.
Helen was known for being really reliable. She even babysat for families in her neighborhood.
And Christine, she'd just moved into her own apartment, excited about her new job as a typist.
So nothing out of the ordinary then.
Not at all. This wasn't a case of, teenagers out looking for trouble.
They were just at a pub, enjoying themselves.
Until these two mysterious men show up.
Mysterious how?
Well, witnesses described them as well-dressed, short hair, which was unusual in the late 70s.
Ah, yeah, long hair was all the rage back then.
So they really stood out, almost like they were trying to, project an image.
Maybe to blend in, knowing what they were really up to.
Totally.
It is.
So what do we know about how they interacted with the girls?
Witnesses saw them leaving the pub together.
With Helen and Christine.
Yeah, and later a police patrol actually spotted them. One of the girls tripped. They even overheard them arguing about getting in a car with these men.
So they were literally right there.
Yeah, a sign of the danger, but they didn't realize at the time.
And tragically, that was the last time anyone saw those girls alive.
The next morning, a couple on a beach, they found Christine's body.
On a beach?
Yeah, they were having a picnic, imagine.
God, can you imagine?
She had been bound, gagged, sexually assaulted, and strangled.
And then miles away, a man walking his dog found Helen's body.
Also murdered.
Brutally.
It's hard to imagine the horror of finding those young women. The news for their families must have been devastating.
Both fathers had to identify their daughters' bodies.
Unimaginable.
This wasn't typical for Edinburgh.
No, people were terrified, thinking it was a serial killer.
There were even comparisons to the Bible John murders in Glasgow.
A few years earlier, right?
Yeah, that case had cast a long shadow.
Unsolved, right?
Still is.
Wow.
So the police, they launched a huge investigation, 80 officers, they mapped the pub, countless interviews.
Must have been chaos.
But they had very few leads.
Besides the descriptions of the men and their clothing.
That's it.
Dedicated, but technology back then wasn't what it is now.
Well, they did find semen on Helen's coat.
Oh, right. But DNA analysis was in its infancy in 77?
What could they even do with that back then?
Determined blood type, that's about it.
So it went cold.
It did, yeah.
How long?
Years. It was a long wait. False leads, rumors, deadbeat husbands, underworld figures, you name it, it all led to nothing.
And the family's just waiting.
It wasn't until 1988 that they finally got a DNA profile from the semen.
But still no match.
Nope. They tested hundreds of samples, but nothing.
What a nightmare.
But they did confirm that there were two killers.
Two?
And one man raped both girls.
We mentioned earlier that would be important later.
It is. And this is where Angus Sinclair comes in.
That name. He's the one who's ultimately convicted, right?
Yes, but it's a long and complicated story.
I bet it is.
Complicated is an understatement. Sinclair's criminal history. It's,
Well, it's horrifying.
And it started young, didn't it? Way too young. We're talking petty theft, breaking, and entering as a teenager, but things escalated fast.
So this wasn't just a troubled kid. This was something more.
Oh, much more. When Sinclair was just 16, he lured his 7-year-old neighbor into a stairwell.
Oh, God, no.
Sexually assaulted her and strangled her to death.
That's just awful.
He even called an ambulance afterwards, claimed she'd fallen down the stairs.
Trying to cover it up even then.
Exactly. At 16, a psychiatrist who evaluated him back then, he said Sinclair was obsessed with sex, posed a huge danger to others, and likely to reoffend.
That's a terrifying assessment.
It is. And despite that warning, he only served 6 years for that murder.
6 years for killing a child.
A tragically inadequate sentence. And just like the psychiatrist predicted Sinclair's violence, it continued after he got out.
He didn't stop.
No, string of rapes and assaults. He was even suspected in other murders that were eerily similar to the World's End case. Young women bound, gagged, strangled.
Just like Christine and Helen.
Yes, a horrifying pattern. And yet it took years for investigators to connect him to those murders.
But how? Didn't he give a DNA sample at some point?
He did. Back in '99, he was arrested for another murder this time. A young woman named Mary Gallagher. She was only 17.
Another 17-year-old.
I know. It's heartbreaking, isn't it? He gave a DNA sample then, but get this. A bureaucratic error meant it wasn't matched to the World's End case until 2004.
You're kidding.
I wish I was. 5 years. He could have been caught sooner, maybe even prevented another tragedy.
Just awful. So by the time they finally made the connection, he was already serving a life sentence for Mary Gallagher's murder.
Right, but remember, there were 2 killers in the World's End case.
That's right. So what about the accomplice?
Finding him became top priority, and DNA provided another lead analysis of that second semen sample. Well, it revealed a link to the paternal line of Sinclair's wife's brothers.
His brother-in-law.
Yeah, it's a twisted family connection, isn't it? Investigators quickly zeroed in on Gordon Hamilton, one of the brothers.
Did they get him?
Sadly, no, Hamilton had died in 1996.
He got away with it.
He did. He never faced justice for his role in the World's End murders. It's a truly frustrating turn of events.
I can only imagine the anger and despair the families felt.
But even with Hamilton gone, the police were determined to build a solid case against Sinclair. They had their man, and they weren't letting him go.
But their first attempt, the 2007 trial, didn't go as planned, did it?
No, it was a disaster. The prosecution made a huge mistake. They relied solely on that semen sample and didn't present any of the DNA evidence from the ligatures that linked Sinclair to both crime scenes.
Why on earth would they do that?
It baffles legal experts to this day. Some think it was a strategic blunder. Others think there were issues with the way the ligature DNA was collected or analyzed. Whatever the reason, it backfired spectacularly.
And Sinclair's defense was that he'd had consensual sex with both girls.
Can you believe that?
After all we know about him. A convicted rapist and murderer.
It was audacious, but because the prosecution's case was so narrow, the judge ruled there wasn't enough evidence. The charges were dismissed.
He got off on a technicality.
He did. Protected by double jeopardy laws at the time, the public was outraged.
And rightfully so. It's unbelievable that he was able to walk free.
It is. The outcry over this case, with all its twists and turns, actually led to major changes in Scottish law.
Really?
Oh, yeah. The Double Jeopardy Scotland Act of 2011 was a landmark change. It allows for retrials in cases of really serious miscarriages of justice.
So something good came out of all this horror.
It did. The World's End murders became a prime example of why this change was so desperately needed.
So there was a retrial.
There was, in 2014.
Tell me they got it right this time.
This time was different. The prosecution learned from their mistakes and presented a much stronger case.
They used all the DNA evidence.
They did, from the ligatures, soil samples placing Sinclair at both scenes, expert testimony about his pattern of violence.
No more loopholes.
No more loopholes. The jury didn't hesitate. They found him guilty.
Finally.
He was sentenced to 37 years. He died in prison in 2019.
A bittersweet victory. Justice was delayed, but it was served.
It was, but one killer was never held accountable, and the families had to wait far too long for even this much. It's hard, even with the conviction, there was never really closure for the families of Christine and Helen.
Because Sinclair died in prison, never admitting his guilt.
Yeah, took his secrets to the grave. And you have to wonder, are there other victims out there? Other families who never got answers?
It's a chilling thought.
It is a reminder that this kind of darkness exists, and its impact, it's far-reaching.
This case, it really stays with you. The brutality, the decades of uncertainty, the eventual conviction, but also the pain and the unanswered questions. What do you think our listeners should take away from all of this?
Well, for me, it shows how important vigilance is. In our legal systems, I mean. We need thorough investigations, careful evidence collection, strong DNA databases, so perpetrators are brought to justice quickly and effectively.
And the power of DNA technology to uncover the truth even after so many years. The scientists and investigators who work on these cold cases, they never give up.
They don't. It's incredible. But beyond the forensics and the legal battles, this case is about 2 young women, Christine and Helen, whose lives were cut tragically short.
It makes you think about how fragile life is. And how important it is to cherish every moment, appreciate the people we love.
Because you never know what might happen.
Exactly. Random acts of violence can change everything in an instant.
And it's a testament to the human spirit, the families. They endured years of uncertainty and heartbreak, but never gave up hope for justice.
This deep dive, it's been a journey through a dark chapter, but it shows how far we've come with DNA technology.
Oh, absolutely. We have powerful tools now to solve crimes that might have stayed mysteries forever.
And the legal reforms that came about because of this case, like the Double Jeopardy Act in Scotland.
Yeah, that was huge. Even when there are setbacks, justice can prevail.
Yeah.
Our systems, even if they're imperfect, they can evolve and adapt.
So what can we all take away from this? I think it's a reminder to be aware, look out for each other, never give up hope. Even the most complex cases can be solved.
And to support victims of crime and their families, their journey to healing and justice can be so long and difficult.
We may never fully understand what drove Angus Sinclair, but we can learn from this, work towards a safer future, and find some solace in knowing that justice eventually was served.
The world's end murders. They remind us that darkness can never truly overcome the light of hope and the pursuit of truth.
And that even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, the human spirit can endure and find a way to move forward.
It can. It really can.
And that's our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.